To open this evening's presentation, Brian has selected a poem titled "The Earth is the Home of All Mankind" by Clifford Monks. The earth is the home of all mankind, its ceiling the blue sky above. Its floor is the ground on which we walk, upheld by a selfless love. The sun warms our home in the daytime, moon and stars light the night, and over it all, with great wisdom, God rules with a lawful might. And out of this home, with heaven's help, from water, fire, air, and earth, is fashioned a house for each human soul to dwell in from time of birth. The heart is the sun that warms our house. The stars are the light in our mind. And when in our deeds there is warmth and light, then God's Son finds a home in mankind.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Thank you very much. Clifford Monks is a very dear colleague of many of us. Many of us here knew Clifford. He left us in 2017 in July, but a wonderful poet and a wonderful Waldorf teacher and a wonderful anthroposophist, wonderful human being. So I thought it appropriate, because if we really think about it, and Rudolf Steiner gives us beautiful pictures about the nature of all the arts. He says to us, I'm going to see if I can share screen here. So what Rudolf Steiner does, he gives us a picture that all of the arts are in fact extensions of the human being. So he says, for instance, if the forces which are shaping the human body, the physical body, if we take all the forces shaping the head and the chest and the limbs, and we express them out into the kingdoms of nature, architecture arises. Architecture is the manifestation of the laws shaping the physical body that we press out into the mineral and the plant and the animal kingdom. And so architecture arises as a manifestation of the forces shaping the physical body. He tells us sculpture arises through our pressing the etheric or the life body, the living forces, down into the physical body. Then the art of sculpture arises. So sculpture is also deeply connected with the human being. He says, if we press the astral body down into the etheric body, the art of painting arises. So painting is the natural manifestation of the astral body pressing down into the etheric body. He then says, if the ego begins to press itself down into the astral body, the art of music arises. And in fact, we could say there are two aspects of music. There is instrumental music, and there is also choral music or vocal music. We sing where the human body itself becomes the instrument. And we could say that those are two stages of manifestation of music, one more toward the kingdoms of nature and the musical instruments, and one more toward the art of speech, which is our next the next art form. So he says, then if we have transformed when we are working to transform our astral body to spirit self, or to manas, and we press that purified astral body of manas or spirit self down toward the ego, the art of poetry, drama, and speech arises. He says further, if we have transformed the etheric body to some degree to life spirit or buddhi, and we press the life spirit down toward the spirit self, the art of eurythmy arises. And finally, the highest member that we will be able to achieve in the foreseeable future is the spirit form, also called Atman or spirit man. And he says, if we, that is the transformed forces of the physical body, completely refined and spiritualized, if we press those forces down into the region of the life spirit, the art of community arises.
Mm.
So all 7 arts are really extensions of the human being. But of all of them, in a certain sense, architecture is very primal because it is the one closest to the kingdoms of nature, and the one which most immediately, as soon as a child is born, the child needs to be protected and so forth. So anyway, we begin to have this lovely sense. So we see here, Rudolf Steiner, of course, was lived between 1861 and 1925. And we are deeply indebted to the work of Rudolf Steiner. He has accomplished so much on our behalf, and he has done just an incredible amount of work on our behalf. So what he did was, of course, he was the founder of the Goetheanum. And what he did was he took all the 7 arts and he said he wanted to unite architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, speech, drama, eurythmy, and community building into one structure, an ambitious undertaking. He mentioned that Wagner had also aspired to have a house and that would perform, where he could perform his Parsifal opera and so forth. And also, but he said, we have in mind a kind of Bayreuth, a kind of Wagnerian picture. But Rudolf Steiner went far beyond what Wagner would have been able to accomplish. And we can see how masterfully he worked. He was not trained as an architect. Rudolf Steiner was not trained as an architect, but he became, like everything else that he touched, he penetrated into the arts very deeply. And now, as we go through this presentation, there will be a temptation to try to explain things as representing other things. And I hope that you will forgive me when I do that occasionally, because Rudolf Steiner was really adamant when he gave a slide presentation, and which is also recorded, by the way, and the images which he used are available in the book. He said, this is not a symbol for something else. This is a pure form. I'm trying to get to the pure form as Goethe spoke about pure form. So in any case, that's part of what he was aspiring to do here. So we see here the Goetheanum. Basically, we see that there is a, can you see my cursor? No?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so you see there's an axis here. This is starting in the west and moving toward the east. So there is actually an axial approach straight on that enters into the west end of the Goetheanum, and this end is due east. So he oriented it due east and west. The main axis is an east-west axis. There is then, and by the way, these two side, I wish I could go back, but I can't go back. These two side wings on the sides were actually added by the suggestion of a colleague of his. And Rudolf Steiner was very open. He didn't close himself and say, no, I'm the only one that can do this. As he designed the building, initially it was 2 cylinders with the cupolas. And basically then at the suggestion of this friend, these 2 side wings come in, and we begin to get the sense that the whole building then takes on even more of a kind of an axial form. Not only do we have this west end and we're moving toward the east, and you see here the stones, the stepping stones, which in a certain sense are not stepping stones, but the little vertical standing stones are kind of aiming us toward the entrance in a very classical way. We'll come back to that. But we'll also see that the Goetheanum itself is a very interesting structure. We see 3 prime forms here. We see a concrete substructure, which is basically like the foot of the building or the base or the foundation of the building. And I'm going to make a claim that part of the building and its approach are really connected to the will and to the limbs of the human being. And then we have a kind of a breathing system in the middle, which is clad in wood, and clad in wood. And this is where we have the windows and the light and the air streaming through. And this is, I'm going to make a case that this is really connected with the chest, the rhythmic system, the feeling life of the human being. And then we have these spherical domes, which are on the large cupule and on the small cupule, which I'm going to claim are in fact an expression of the forces that shape the human head. So basically, in fact, in the foundation stone itself, which when this building was burned to the ground on New Year's Eve of 1922, almost 100 years ago now, it will be 100 years ago this December 31st, and this New Year's Eve and New Year's Day will be exactly 100 years since the burning. Rudolf Steiner said he circled the burning building repeatedly, and he heard speaking from the flames the verse, the foundation stone verse, which he then took into his soul, meditated for a year, and gave it back to the members in the Christmas meeting, the Christmas Foundation meeting of 1924. But the essence of the building, and you can say the essence of the foundation stone, is in response it's an answer to the question, human being, know yourself. Do we know ourselves? Rudolf Steiner, in many different places, says we think that we know the kingdoms of nature. We think we know the mineral and the plant and the animal and everything within our senses, but we don't know our body. We only know the outer form of the body. We have no idea what's going on within us. And we don't know our soul, and we don't know our spirit. So effectively, who are we? And who do we think we are? And how will we ever come to be an effective being if we don't know who we are? So this is the riddle that he says was placed above the temple at Eleusis. This question, human being, know thyself. Man, know yourself. And so we could say it's a challenge and it's a question. We could say the building, the first Goetheanum, is an answer to that. It's the beginning of an answer. It's an artistic expression of how do we know ourselves. So the first panel, the foundation stone, human soul, you live within the limbs which bear you through the world of space into the ocean of spirit being. So we see the human form consists of the head and the chest, which has the upper limbs attached to it, and then the metabolic limb system, the lower legs and the feet, which carry us through the world of space. So human soul, you live within the limbs which bear you through the world of space into the ocean of spirit being. Human soul, second panel, you live within the beat of heart and lung, which guides you through the rhythms of time into the feeling of your own soul being. Third panel, human soul, you live within the resting head, which out of eternity's foundations reveals to you world thoughts. So friends, we begin to see that the Goetheanum itself, the opening gesture of the Goetheanum is that it is threefold. It expresses the limb nature, the chest nature, and the head nature of the human being, which are the foundation. The limb nature is the basis of our will, the chest nature is the basis of our feeling, and the head nature is the basis of our waking consciousness and thinking. Now, by the way, there is also following each of these opening lines a practice. And Rene Creda used to, when he would speak about the foundation stone, Rene often would say, there was a young musician who came to New York City with his violin, and he didn't exactly know his way around. So he asked a stranger, he said, "How do I get to Carnegie Hall?" And the man said, "Practice, practice, practice." So Rudolf Steiner, the foundation stone, after these descriptions of living in the limbs which bear you through the world of space into the ocean of spirit being, practice spirit remembering in depths of soul, where in the wielding world creator existence, one's own I comes into being within the eye of God, and you will truly live in human world being. The second practice, after human soul, you live within the beat of heart and lung, which guides you through the rhythms of time into the feeling of your own soul being. Practice spirit pondering, spirit sensing, spirit mindfulness, and balance of soul, where the surging world becoming deeds, one's own eye unite with the eye of the world, and you will truly feel in human soul working. The third panel, human soul, you live within the resting head, which out of eternity's foundations reveals to you world thoughts. Practice spirit beholding, spirit envisioning, and quietness of thought, where the eternal aims of God's world being light on one's own eye bestow for free and active willing, and you will truly think in human spirit foundations. So with the limbs, we will truly live. Through the limbs, we will truly feel. Through the beat of heart and lung, we will truly think with the resting head. And that follow. There are panels which follow, which we'll come to later. So when we look at some of the ancient remains, this is the Temple of Luxor in Egypt, the ground plan. Well, actually, it's an aerial photograph of the ruins of the Temple of Luxor. And a wonderful researcher named Schwaller de Lubeck wrote a book about this because he discovered something very interesting. He says, if you look at that structure itself, it is in fact the plan of the human form. You see the human head articulated at the top. We see the neck extended and the larynx. In fact, the throat, the larynx is in fact a special little room in the Temple of Luxor. We see the arms extending out to the sides. We see the chest and the metabolic system and the center portions. And then we see the 7 pairs of limbs, the 7 pairs of pillars, which are connected with the biggest bones in the body, which are the legs, the thigh bones. And then we see double bones. And in fact, the lower legs and the lower forearms both have double bones in them. We see a colonnade of double columns and the lower portion, and then we see the feet as these 2 pylon walls at the base. So we find that the Temple of Luxor is in fact, it is the human form. It is the human being lying down. So when he says, and he swallowed the Lubeck further, he said, if we look at these bones, he says, if you look at the bones, every bone has a threefoldness to it. Every bone has a head, it has a shaft, and it has a foot. So we can begin to see that the head and the chest and the limb nature is also a principal character of every bone in the human body. Remember, if we take the forces which have shaped the human being, project them into the kingdoms of nature, architecture arises. So we see that the limbs are also a beautiful expression of the threefold formative principle shaping the physical body. If we look at now the limb architecture, and we go to the distant past, we go into the region of the time after the Great Flood, when the skies cleared and we began to see the rainbow, and the sun began to penetrate back through the clouds, and the water had settled into the ocean basins more or less as they are today after the Atlantean flood. And we come to the earliest civilizations, many people who lived in caves even during the Atlantean period of time. And we see that, interestingly, they are emphasizing their limbs in their graphics. Is this just a stylistic reason, or is there something that they are more aware of their limbs than anything else? If you understand, of course, that they lived without automobiles and without cell phones and without all the conveniences that we have, without the lazy. In fact, someone once, I think one of Rudolf Steiner's pupils have said, the head is actually the lazy bones. The head doesn't do a darn thing. It's the passenger sitting on top of our shoulders, and it's being kind of carried around on the chest, which is breathing, and the limbs, which are moving it through space. But the head itself is just a spectator. Interesting picture. Anyway, you see that their consciousness was not so strongly developed in their head, but their limbs, particularly their legs, were well developed because that was a prime experience of their life. Of course, we're speaking about us and our previous incarnations as well. But we see, I consider this early phase of architecture to be primarily limb architecture. We see it in the engravings, the lovely forms that we see here, these spiral forms and labyrinths. We see it in the upright stone. The upright stones are really like the upright human being. In fact, we know from Rudolf, and it's very obvious if we watch children develop, when the child is born, it is horizontal. But in the first year of life, the child strives to stand upright. And so you could say in the first year of life, the child stands upright and it comes out of the horizontal into the vertical, into uprightness. That's a limb activity. In the second year of life, the child begins to speak, which is the result of a breathing system activity. In the third year of life, the child gradually begins to think and form concepts about the world. And then at the beginning of the fourth year, the child begins to refer to itself as I. So anyway, we see the same thing in the history of architecture. We start with limb architecture coming into uprightness, and we also see these long avenues of stones wandering through the landscape, but basically in an east-west direction. So these stones, you can see these are massive stones. Again, these stones, they didn't call up somebody and have them and bring in a crane to move these huge monolithic pieces of stone. They used their own strength, their own limbs, to move these stones into place and to set them up. And look at this was a massive piece of construction, and they accomplished it beautifully and aligned it with the east-west pattern of the cosmos, of the sunrise and sunset and the seasons. So we see this is limb architecture, and we do notice, by the way, that these rows, these avenues, these axes of stones give us a kind of a compulsion to move along the avenue itself. We're kind of compelled to start at one end and move toward the other goal. Yeah. But these standing stones are immense. These are not small. These are not things that you just would set up in your backyard easily. So we also see the beginning, in some cases, of putting a capstone and this capstone over the uprights and the beginning to create a kind of a protective shelter, which is also a gesture. It's really a limb gesture, but it's a limb gesture which is beginning to experiment with a kind of a roof. By the way, Frank Lloyd Wright, wonderful architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, he loved to go out to eat. He loved to go to restaurants and be fed. And he watched the waiters and the waitresses carrying huge trays full of food on five fingers. They would have their 5 fingers underneath the tray, and the tray would be burdened with all kinds of plates and cups and saucers and food, and it would be cantilevered out beyond the limits of their fingers. And Frank Lloyd Wright said, why don't we build buildings like that? And so Frank Lloyd Wright began to use the cantilever as a result of that experience. Anyway, we begin to see architecture is also coming into various kinds of expression. But we also know that the forces of weight, which are bearing down from that capstone, are tremendous. And the forces of levity, the forces of uplifting, it's interesting that that tremendous weight is being carried on 3 points. And these 3 points of stones are all that's holding, you could say, but the weight-bearing forces are so concentrated that the downward forces of weight and the upward forces of levity and lightness are able to come into balance here. Beautiful expression. We also find stone circles in many different places. And we're going to move through these slides fairly quickly, but this is all limb architecture. We also find New Grange was a kind of a it was an axial structure oriented toward a sunrise position, and they built a cave over the they then closed it with earth for a particular reason. But when we look at Newgrange, we'll see that Newgrange is oriented toward the sun, sunrise at winter solstice. And so you can say this entire mound of earth and the surrounding stones around it were basically to celebrate and to protect this actually cross-shaped form of avenue of stones that leads to an interior experience. It's at Newgrange. And this is a picture of that passageway. And there was actually a roof box which allowed the rising sun at the winter solstice to enter in through the roof box and to penetrate all the way back toward the heel stone and flood then this inner chamber with light. So once a year, at the time of the winter solstice, this interior would be flooded with light. Wonderful experience. And the rest of the year, it was largely dark. And we find these beautiful spiraled forms, again, showing us their knowledge of the changing of the seasons, the moving of the sun, the moving of the planets, and the moving of the earth. A tremendous sense of movement in these forms. Yes. And those spiral forms continue to be engraved and carved into the ceiling of Newgrange as well. So anyway, being connected with the limbs also, in a certain sense, connects us very deeply with the cosmos. For the Father Spirit of the heights holds sway, and world depths begetting being. You spirits of strength, seraphim, cherubim, thrones, let from the heights ring forth what in the depths finds its echo, speaking this, ex Deo nascimur, from God we are born. This the spirits of the elements hear, and east, west, north, south, may human beings hear it. This is the rest of the first panel of the foundation stone. So anyway, we have this beautiful sense of standing stones forming cosmic orientations, and whereas Newgrange was oriented toward the sunrise at winter solstice, Stonehenge is oriented toward the sunrise at summer solstice. Very interesting pattern. And when we look at the relationship of these stones, they begin, we see of course, there were 5 pairs of stones kind of oriented as major stones, but then around the edge, these beautiful stones which have a sense of community. It's almost like a group of human beings standing side by side, forming a circle with their arms stretched out to the shoulders, wrapped around the shoulders of their neighbors. Do you see that? We could even begin to picture the upright human being kind of with our arms over each other's shoulders, reaching out and forming a circle. So again, remember, architecture arises through the forces shaping the human being extended out into the kingdoms of nature. Limb architecture primarily, but already beginning to give a hint of community. We here also find in the ziggurats these incredible pathways. It takes a lot of strength to climb those stairways, particularly you get to be my age. But anyway, you begin to feel this tremendous willpower to put those stones into place to build the ziggurats, and then these long venues of stairways leading up to these temple settings at the top. Limb architecture, yes. Even in the placement of the 3 pyramids of Giza, we find something of a riddle. And of course, there are arguments still going on to this day. They'll never stop. Are the 3 pyramids in the Giza plateau, are they aligned to the 3? Are they similar to the 3 stars and Orion's belt or not? And I have a feeling that there's a relationship, but I have to say that the people who have been trying to promote that aren't always playing completely fair. But anyway, we begin to get a sense of that there seems to be a relationship between the 3 pyramids of Giza and the 3 stars in Orion's belt. Again, there is a cosmic orientation here in Egypt. And we do find, in fact, that the passageways in the Great Pyramid do orient themselves to particular stars, to the star Sirius and to the third star in Orion's belt and so forth. So there is certainly a cosmic orientation to the pyramids themselves. And placed out in front of the center pyramid is this magnificent Sphinx. And the Sphinx is basically posing a riddle to us. Human being, know yourself. Who are you? The Sphinx is a riddle. It doesn't speak. It's silent. And yet it was said that at certain times of the year, this sounds would issue forth from the Sphinx. The Sphinx would speak to human beings who had ears to hear. So anyway, there is this riddle placed in the Sphinx again, but again, we're speaking primarily about limb architecture here. This is the Temple of Luxor itself. Here we're looking at the bottom of the feet, if you will. The pylon walls are like the two feet extending out, and we're going between the feet and penetrating between the legs up toward the chest and the head of the structure. So you see that the entire structure, it starts with the upraised pylon walls. The whole structure, of course, has had other additions, temples and so forth built inside it. But basically, one could begin to imagine in the general form that, yes, this was, when it was complete, it was really like the head was at this end, and you have the chest, and here's the limbs and the lower legs and the pylon walls and so forth. Anyway, this is limb architecture, but really beautifully organized to express something. Now, as we move up from the pelvis up into the trunk of the human body, and we begin to come into these vertebrae, which are metamorphosing in their shapes. The lower vertebrae continually are keeping their basic principles, but they're moving from the lower spine up into the middle and up into the upper regions of the spine. And we find a very particular part of this metamorphosing vertebrae that has a particular quality of repeating and enclosing. And we see in this gesture that begins to arise in Greece, this appreciation for the grace and the movement of the breathing system. And so what we find is the chest is, in fact, this place where the rhythmic tides of time, the beat of heart and lung. We know we breathe about 18 times a minute, but our pulse is about 4 times as fast, about 72 pulses per minute. So there's this rhythm of 1 to 4 pulsing within us. Are we aware of that? We now need little devices and machines to take our blood pressure and to count our pulse. But in fact, are we really in touch with the breathing? We're not really in touch with breathing any more than we're in touch with the movement of our limbs, except that we want to do something and our legs will obey us without any problem. So if we look at the architecture of Greece and Rome, we find it is primarily chest architecture. It's breathing. There's space and there's air. There's this beautiful sense of rhythm in the Parthenon set on the Acropolis high above Athens. And this beautiful picture of the breathing system of the chest is coming to expression here. So we're now, as we enter Greece and Rome, up until right up to the time of the Renaissance, primarily we're in a period of chest architecture, I would call it, breathing, rhythmic system, repetition, and we begin to see the introduction of a kind of what will become the curved bones of the rib cage. We find in the Parthenon frieze this beautiful manifestation, this incredible sensitivity that the Greek sculptor had, and the feeling for, again, you begin to feel that this beautiful breathing system and this beautiful expression, you feel that this is actually cloth, this is actually linen draped over flesh, doesn't it? I mean, their sculptural qualities are really remarkable because they're beginning to take into account the etheric forces much more strongly than the Egyptians were able to. So there's this breathing system coming into the etheric, which is also expressing itself in this kind of architecture. If we look at the Porch of Maidens, those maidens are effortlessly carrying a tremendous amount of weight on their head. And we also begin to see the origin of the word column. The column has a capital. What is a capital? The capital is the head of the human being. The shaft, of course, is the trunk of the human being, and the base, the foot of the column, the base of the column are the feet. So we begin to see that a column is in fact a human being. And the Greeks express this beautifully in the Porch of Maidens, but you also begin to feel how effortlessly they carry the tremendous weight on their heads, and yet they even have one leg slightly bowed out. They're not under any stress. But again, this beautiful sense of rhythm, this rhythmic system, the forces of life streaming up, and the forces of rhythm and breathing and circulation carrying the load. So anyway, this beautiful pictures, and we begin to get these open amphitheaters, which are really like rib cages. They're like kind of rib cages where human beings gather together in community, and they share in the art of drama and music and poetry and so forth, and speech. They gather to hear each other speak, but they gather in these forms which are very much connected with the rib nature. In Rome, they developed the arch to a very high degree. And we see that Rome has a great deal of limb architecture still there, but also beginning to build more and more with these rounded arches which are really like the repetitive nature of the rib cage and the chest. So the rounded bones, whereas the straight linear bones are more connected with limb architecture, the curved bones of the chest are repeating here beautifully, and these arched patterns. So we find these arches becoming really the symbol of Rome, and we begin to feel that this is chest architecture. Yes, there's still a tremendous limb activity going on to create these things, but look at the beautiful grace and the feeling of rhythm that begins to arise through these curved arches. And large spans begin to become possible because of the curved arches. So we find that even in the Colosseum, which has been stripped of its outer cladding, nonetheless, we get this kind of oval shape, even these elliptical shapes of kind of the rib cage itself, which is not completely circular at all. But again, these the sense of rhythmic architecture, chest architecture, the Arch of Triumph, rhythmic architecture, the Pantheon. And I think the Pantheon is, I've heard from Mary Jo, that's one of her favorite buildings. A beautiful structure, and this beautiful sense. But and if you look at it, it looks, there's a front there, which is kind of receiving you up the steps as kind of limb introduction. But then you enter into it, and you come into a space where the light and air are streaming into the ceiling. And it's the most remarkable experience to go into this building enclosed on all sides, but to see the light and the air streaming in. And I consider this to be, although you begin to feel that it's moving toward a head nature, that in fact it's really chest architecture primarily. It's a beautiful rhythmic system. Everything is repeating, circular, coming up into the dome. The dome is approaching, I would say the dome is like the upper portion of the rib cage, whereas the lower portion of the rib cage is more the floating ribs. And you get the attached ribs and the curvature portion above. And then you begin to realize that what could be sitting above there would be a head, but the head itself is absent, but it's allowing the cosmic light and life and air to stream in through above, from the above. So anyway, the Pantheon I would consider also to be chest architecture, rhythmic architecture. Again, this light streaming in. What a beautiful picture. If only our thinking were as bright as this light, it would be, So anyway, now, and we also see in the early Christian architecture, two basic building forms take place. One is a kind of linear, it's called an axial plan structure, which is this church. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople. It had two portions to it. It had a chapel, which was a central plan structure, where where everything is equally spaced from the center, and then it had this axial form, basilica form. Yes. So this early Christian basilica form, and again you find the compelling of the parallel axial columns and colonnades leading toward a particular goal. So you could say that this building doesn't leave you free. It kind of demands your attention toward the altar. It kind of you're compelled by the lines to follow it and to go toward the goal there, which is horizontal. Whereas in the upright chapel, you feel everything is much more at rest, and you begin to feel that you're more in relationship to the vertical axis here. Now, this is very important because Rudolf Steiner will integrate two domes in his structure. The large cupola will be of one particular nature, will be more of a compelling nature, and a little bit more horizontally oriented, even though it is the larger of the two cupolas, but it's leading to a smaller cupola where things are more centrally focused and more upright and more peaceful, and more like the resting head. We also see the Romanesque versions of the Romanesque extension of the axial plan structures in these Romanesque churches. And then the Gothic, of course, the Charter takes it to a very fine degree forward. By the way, Chartres is also this magical Chartres. Everybody knows it, and all you have to do is go there and you feel it. My goodness, Chartres is a completely magical place. I've done some research on Chartres. I looked at the forms of it and the plan in particular, and you begin to realize that again, Chartres is the human being. You approach it from the. You could say if you were to take these two spires and to lay them down in front, you'd have the two legs extending out in front. So it's really like a kind of human being with their legs up, and those are the two spires that are the bases here. Then you're coming in between the legs into the chest and to the center of the building and back up toward the head, which is at the very far end, the apse. So Chartres itself is a beautiful structure. This is actually a combination of the Stonehenge plan and the same scale as Chartres. Interesting that they have a similar dynamic and a similar proportion. But Chartres was oriented toward the northeast. Yeah. And when you look at Chartres, again, it's a very, very striking structure. And you begin to see that the rounded arches are now giving way to a pointed arch. The pointed arch is the attempt to begin to move toward the head, but it's not quite there. Yeah. We also see in these three openings at the entrance, the entrance of Chartres. Above the entrance is this beautiful intersection of two. It's called the Vesica Pisces, the Vesica Piscis, and inside the Vesica Piscis is the form of Christ Jesus. And if we look at the sculptures within, of course, we get these beautiful pictures of Adam and being created by God, and the animals being created and so forth. The whole story of creation is in the sculptural work inside the structure and on the outside as well. You get these beautiful flying buttresses, which are again like ribs, which are extending and supported from outside, that allow these tremendous windows, these beautiful windows of stained glass, to let light and color and air through the structure. So this structure is primarily a chest structure, but it has beautiful qualities of rib nature, and allows these dark interior surfaces to be penetrated by the beautiful colored lights of these stained glass windows. And of course, the ceiling itself is quite a lovely expression. And again, beautiful color streaming through these windows. Here's the two intersecting circles. Now, Rudolf Steiner will build us a building of two intersecting circles as well. But here we see it. The principle here is to form the Gothic arch. The Gothic arch is really formed, you could say, of the upper portion of these two vesicas. But we also see that this becomes the plan. If we took, someone is very cleverly taken the plan of the of Chartres Cathedral that you can see there in outline form, and laid it over the vesica of the figure of Christ at the entrance, and realized that again you see that the plan of Chartres is the form of the human being. In this case, it's the form of the Christ being. And if we were to take that vesica image of the plan forward into these kind of auras, there's a beautiful book on Chartres which does this in quite a lovely way, builds it up quite beautifully. You begin to see these different experiences of the vesica within the structure itself. The entranceway, the center portion, and then the head region up here. Now, in looking at the structure and looking at I noticed that by the way, if you start from this particular place here, if you started, there are 12 bays. Other cathedrals have other numbers, but Chartres has 12 bays. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer. The central bay is Leo, the rhythmic system, the heart. And then you go after Leo, you get Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. So one of the mysteries of Chartres is that the whole all 12 constellations of the zodiac are there. And in addition to the whole human form, we can see a 4-petaled lotus at the entranceway. Where this labyrinth is in fact the 6-petaled lotus, which is connected with the 4-petaled lotus is connected with the moon. The labyrinth is actually in the same place that this yellow circle is, and it is expressing the dynamic of 6. It's the 6-petaled lotus. Then we have the 10-petaled lotus at the solar plexus, and the 12-petaled lotus of the sun. The solar plexus is connected with Venus. Then we get the sun chakra at the very center of the structure. Again, this beautiful mystery that the sun in Leo as the center organ there. There's 12-petal lotus of the sun. Then the 16-petal lotus of the throat, the 2-petal lotus of the brow up in the apse, and then the crown chakra above this 1,000-petal lotus is the beautiful development at the end of Chartres, the east end. So anyway, Chartres itself is worth many hours, if not days and weeks and months of study. It's an incredible place. But now we need to move on into the head frame. So when we get to the Renaissance, we begin to realize that the human head has not yet been fully developed in architecture. The limbs and the chest have been beautifully developed, but the head is lacking. So this is the next thing to be attempted. So with the Renaissance, we begin to get, in the age of the consciousness soul, we begin to get this moving up into the consciousness of the head. And Brunelleschi solved a riddle that was a tremendous difficulty. How do you put a dome over this entire? They built the Florence Cathedral. They built it with tremendous assurance that somehow they didn't know how they were going to roof it, but they didn't know how they're going to close over that large opening that they left, that large 8-sided opening that they had. But somehow they thought, well, somebody will come along who can do it. For years and years, it was remained a riddle, and there was just a large hole at the end of the church. And ultimately, they held competitions, and Filippo Brunelleschi, this genius architect, came together, and he figured out a way that if you were to take the Gothic arch and were to then tie and facet it into 8 parts and shape it into that shape, then if you were to bind the base together and were to wrap, it's like taking 8 different things and wrapping them around in such a way that the tension at the base would hold the forces of compression, which are trying to flatten that structure, that would be a solution. So he was able to construct this immense dome. And the dome at Florence Cathedral was solved by Brunelleschi. And to me, in the early 1400s, the middle 1400s, this is the beginning of the head architecture. Brunelleschi leads the way. God bless him. And an amazing solution, an amazing accomplishment. By the way, I think this Brunelleschi's dome is the same size as the large cupola of the first Goetheanum. But this was the first freestanding dome without, and didn't need side aisles or anything else. The dome itself is freestanding. You could literally lift the dome off the top if you were careful, and you could pick the whole thing up and set it aside, and it would remain intact. And it's not dependent upon the structure of the walls. Just the structure of the walls are merely to give it vertical support, but it has the forces of compression binding it together at the base, and the forces of tension and compression are in balance here. Beautiful. We find domes then appearing everywhere in this modern age that we've come into, the age of the consciousness soul. Domes appear, and we begin to feel now the complete, the statue of David, of course, we begin to feel finally, and Michelangelo, a contemporary of Brunelleschi, and later Michelangelo was able then to bring his sculpture to full expression. And I do feel that, of course, David is a youth, but his head even feels a little bit large to me, doesn't it to you? Just a bit. In terms of, it's a beautifully proportioned structure. But anyway, you begin to feel that now the human being is now free. That is, the head is free to gaze and to look and to reason and to wonder. The chest is free, and the arms are free, and the limbs are free. And you begin to feel the complete human being is now beginning to be represented in architecture. And we see various variations of domes appearing in the Taj Mahal and various places. We see domes in England. We see them, of course, in our own capital here in the United States. So domes have appeared everywhere, and they really become the symbol of a kind of a liberation, a kind of a sense of the striving to free our thoughts into a more cosmic understanding. And of course, even Gaudi is expressing a kind of a very limb nature head form, if you will. Gaudi was quite a remarkable sculptor as well as architect. His buildings are fascinating in their detail. He's creating an organic architecture by more or less creating organic plant materials everywhere on the interiors of his structures. Absolutely amazing work. And he also has this beautiful picture of the family, Holy Family, at the Sagrada Familia. And these ornamentations, they're really like aspects of pollen plants. So Gaudi's organic architecture is very much connected with a kind of plant nature. But then he puts these chimney pots on top, which look like masks, don't they? These chimney pots. Wouldn't you like to wear a mask like that instead of the ones we had to wear during COVID? Very interesting pictures of these chimney pots looking at as though they are human heads. So he's very aware of the head nature, Gaudi. And now we're back to the Goetheanum and back to Rudolf Steiner. And so how did Rudolf Steiner integrate these various forms of architecture? How did he bring limb architecture and chest architecture and head architecture together? And how do we see it expressed? And so we can say, first of all, we see, again, this is what I tried to point out earlier, there is these north-south wings that extend out that look a bit like arms. We have a head nature, these arms extending out, the head nature oriented toward the east, the limbs, as the upper arms stretching out toward the north and the south, and then the main chest of the building in the large cupola, then the entranceways is more the metabolic system, and the limb nature extending all the way out toward the major entrance coming from the west. So we see, and along it are an avenue of stones that Rudolf Steiner placed there. So we begin to see that Rudolf Steiner integrates all the history of architecture, but in a very modern way. The limb nature and the chest nature and the head nature is being represented there. And both in the plan view, we also see it that the chest, again, we see from this photograph, the concrete substructure is the foot of the building, it's the limb nature. The wooden and clad structures in the center are the chest nature, and the domes are at the top with the beautiful Norwegian slate tile roofing is the head nature. So quite a beautiful accomplishment, a threefold expression of the chest, of the head, the head, the chest, and the limbs, the region of thinking, feeling, and willing. So the building itself is already awakening in the human being a recognition. There's something familiar about these forms, and that they should be familiar because they're human forms extended out into the space. And we also notice that there are these remarkable shapes over the openings. Where there's an opening, there's a form which is expressing a kind of an expanded form at the upper portion and a contracting form below. And Rudolf Steiner said these forms are actually there to counterbalance. They're there as the normal expression of this would be the tremendous weight is bearing down, and it wants to bow out. It wants to break those. The weight of that span wants to create a tension in the lower portion and a compression in the upper portion. That's countered by by expressing the laws of expansion and extension into the upper portion and the laws of contraction in the lower. These are the etheric counterparts of the forces that are naturally working in the beams and those openings. So these are the counterforms that are balancing the forces of weight and levity in the structure. And again, here we see the threefold nature very clearly. You come in through the limbs. By the way, it's always curious, both in the first and the second Goetheanum, you come into the entranceway, and there's two, you walk back to the underneath, and you walk back underneath, and you go to the cloakroom, then you come out again, and you can choose to go up one side or the other. You can go up the north or the south stairway. And so suppose you see somebody, and so what would happen is, first of all, architects criticized Rudolf Steiner. They said, this is poor circulation. You're letting people into the building, taking them back to the cloakroom. Then they have to turn around and walk back out the same path. They're just going to keep running into people. And Rudolf Steiner said, exactly. We are in fact trying to build a community here, and not a bunch of strangers. We're not trying to stream people through the building and get them out of it. We're trying to create a place where people meet each other. So suppose you see somebody and you say, I don't really want to meet them, so I'm going to go up this side. I see they're going up that side. I'll walk up this side. But what happens, of course, is when you get to the landing, you're at the red window, you're face to face with them once again. And so you keep running into people. There's a beautiful sense of community that is really kind of it still leaves you very free, but you have this limb nature that you're running into each other, and you then enter in through these double doors, and you come into the space, into a large cupola where there are 7 pairs of pillars moving around and inside, and there's a line of symmetry, and there is usually a stage, a curtain perhaps, and there's a stage there and a speaker's rostrum, and then there are 12 pairs of pillars. 12 pillars standing on the small cupola with thrones beneath them. And so anyway, we begin to see this beautiful structure here. Again, here's the entry into the ground floor. Move up the stairways, come up into the upper space, go underneath the organ loft, and you come into a space which has 7 pairs of pillars: the Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus pillars are back here. And then we come to 12 pairs of pillars, to 12 pillars standing on the stage. So, and we see that this is the large cupola space. There's in fact an architrave dividing these two spaces. The architrave is in fact the beam above the columns, and then the domes are resting on these architraves. The architraves also have these remarkable, not only are all the pillars, the capitals of each of the pillars is different, but there's also this beautiful patterning of structures, of sculptures, weaving between the capitals. And Rudolf Steiner says those are actually showing the metamorphic relationships between the various stages of cosmic evolution. So we're going to do a quick survey of these. Let's see. Yeah. By the way, these 7 pillars, the forms of the 7 pillars, Rudolf Steiner already had derived those in Munich, and they appeared in Munich at the Munich Congress as painted onto flat flat boards, but the basic pillar, the basic expression of the sun, of the Saturn, the Jupiter, the Saturn pillars, the sun pillars, the moon pillars, and so forth. Those basic forms were established in 1907 at the Munich Congress. And Rudolf Steiner then continued to use them. And he said, these are really archetypal forms. They're not representing anything. They are the pure forces showing metamorphic stages of growth. And so we see the two cylinders, the cylindrical basis of the Goetheanum being structured here, and the domes beginning to be built as well. Here we're looking at the small cupola and the larger cupola behind under construction. And here we again come to the entrance from the west. We're moving toward the east, and we see this beautiful, the sense of again, we note again this form of expansion above the opening and contraction below. There's the etheric counterpart of the forces that would bend something down and put the lower portion in tension and the upper portion in contraction. This is the counterpart of that. And so we see these beautiful forms of, again, the limb nature, the chest nature, and the head nature greeting us as we enter the building. When we come in and go past, we then have these two stairways. The stairways themselves are beautifully an expression in concrete, and the lower portion of the building is largely in concrete. The way he sculpts the forms themselves, you begin to feel like these are like, they're not hip bones, but there's even in this form here, which is connected with the Rudolf Steiner said he sculpted this form to help the human being get their equilibrium as they go up these stairs, because you're climbing and turning at the same time. You needed to keep your balance. So he sculptured this form, and then realized that these are the three forms that we have within the inner ear, which allow us to keep balance. He said, I wasn't copying them. I was looking for the forces that would balance the forces of the vertical and the horizontal and the right and left. And that's the form I came to. And then I realized that that was in fact the form which we have within our inner ear to help us keep balance. So anyway, these forms are beautifully arranged and beautifully sculpted. And then we come into the large cupola itself, and we come into the organ loft, and we notice that, of course, the pillars are getting larger as we move from Saturn. Saturn is back here. Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus. But we see, again, these beautiful forms. This is, of course, a plaster model. But now here we see a photograph. So here we have come in underneath the organ loft, and the two Saturn pillars are on either side. The Saturn is metamorphosing into the Sun. The Sun is metamorphosing into the Moon. The Moon is metamorphosing into Mars. The Mars is metamorphosing into Mercury, then into Jupiter, and then into Venus. So we're going to do a quick passage through these metamorphic forms. We also see, by the way, that Rudolf Steiner did something quite lovely. Again, we begin to see that each of the woods, that, for instance, between the Saturn pillar was carved out of white beech. Yeah. And so the Saturn pillar was carved out of white beech, and the architrave between the Saturn pillars was white beech. And then the Sun pillar was carved out of ash, and ash moved from between Saturn and the Sun. You have an architrave of ash. And then above the Sun pillar, you get moving to the Moon, which is carved out of cherry wood. So you see that the colors of the woods themselves change colors. Now Rudolf Steiner assigned a different wood to each of the different planets connected. Ancient Saturn connected with the physical body and connected with white beech. Old Sun connected with ash, the old Sun connected with the etheric body. The old Moon connected with our astral body and cherry wood and so forth. So the best way to view this building is actually to go to Dornach now, and they've just completed the 1 to 20 scale a full model showing the interior and the exterior of the building, and it's absolutely magnificent. And I wish we had it instead of having to depend on images. I have very few color images of the interior, sorry. But the model itself does a wonderful job of trying to help us reimagine what a magnificent space it must have been. So he, by the way, he says, I did not choose the woods from any esoteric hubbub or any, he says, I chose the woods for their acoustic properties. And you say, oh, well, how do you know the acoustic properties of the woods? And Rudolf Steiner said, oh, it's easy. You look at the shape of the leaves. Oh, sure, of course. Poor Rudolf Steiner, he must have been, he was speaking to complete dolts, which he was. But these things which were so obvious to him were just, they just seemed beyond our comprehension. Anyway, we also need to realize, of course, that Rudolf Steiner spent over 16 years working sharing the work of Goethe, 18 years. From 1879 till 1897, when he publishes Goethe's Worldview, he spent 18 years of his life editing the scientific works of Goethe, along with many other German idealists. But Goethe was really his main study. 18 years studying the work of Goethe, and he came to the conclusion that Goethe was the Copernicus and Kepler of the organic world. And just as Copernicus and Kepler had come to certain ideas about the mechanics of the solar system and so forth, he says that Goethe came to this beautiful understanding of the metamorphosis of plants and also the theory of colors. So Goethe was, he named the building Goetheanum in honor of this magnificent human being. And Rudolf Steiner often refers to him. So here we see the Saturn pillars in white beech, and then the sun pillar in ash, and the moon pillar in cherry. So, and we see also that we see this, so we're going to follow metamorphosis from one capital to the other, but from Saturn to sun to moon and so forth. But we're also going to notice that these forms over the opening, this form over the opening is a very full shape of expansion and contraction. And as we go to the interior of the building, we see it extended out. You would begin to see that form changes 3 times. It metamorphoses over the 3 openings quite beautifully. So if we look at the principles so we can derive these principles that Rudolf Steiner was working with, the metamorphosis, polarity, and enhancement of forms. Of course, he owes a great deal to Goethe for his understanding of that. Structural harmony and balancing the forces of weight and levity, living expression of convex and concave surfaces. And we build buildings primarily with flat planes because it's cheap. But if you look at any living creature, from a plant to an animal to a human being, life expresses itself in convex and concave surfaces. And particularly life is where you have a convex and a concave surface adjoining each other, these double curved curvatures. Anyway, a living expression of convex and concave surfaces, the living wall that responds to and supports the building's function, transparent color and light, sensitive light to harmonize the human soul, sacred geometry of human cosmic proportion, threefoldness of human form, echoing the human head, chest, and limb organization. These are just a few of the things that Rudolf Steiner was introducing into architecture and really did a beautiful job. So again, if you look at the metamorphosis of plants, if you were to take an annual plant and were to begin to pick off the leaves from the base all the way up to the top, you'd get a pattern that looks like this. And you say, yes, that's interesting. But now if you begin to arrange them as they actually appear, you begin to see that there is a pattern. And the initial stage is at the lower left. You see the stalk and more or less oval form. The oval form begins to be articulated at the rear as it moves up the stem. As we move up toward the middle, we see more and more articulation coming into that form and the forming of triangular shapes out of that oval shape. We begin to get it desiccated into triangular shapes. And And the base also begins to take on a different quality as it begins to thicken. And as we continue on around, we see a further development and a further metamorphosis. And we end up with the base actually receiving the lower part of the base, which was pure stalk, before receiving more of a leaf form. And then the final leaves are, so if you were to look at that leaf and that leaf, you wouldn't think they belong to the same plant. But actually they are different. Metamorphosis is a transformation in sequence and time and space and form that occurs over in a lawful way. And this is what Goethe discovered, that every living thing, every plant, as well as the vertebrae in our body and so forth, every living thing, every animal is connected with the laws of metamorphosis. So if we want a living architecture, we need to bring the principle of metamorphosis in. And he was also, he systematized, you could say, he revealed these in a two-dimensional way and what's called the seven planetary seals. This is the Saturn seal, which is more or less a kind of mineral shape. And during old Saturn, we had primarily the physical body being formed. But then if we add to it the sun stage, if we could say that the blue actually then begins to metamorphose into the white. This is the sun on top of Saturn. And you begin to see that there's a lawful pattern of growth taking place between these two, between the sun and the moon. There's a lawful stage of growth. The etheric body in white begins to enhance and change the forms of the physical body in blue. We then get the astral body coming from the old moon stage, and these purple forms, which laid on top of the sun and the Saturn pillars, we begin to see this beautiful pattern of metamorphosis. If we then add the Mars stage, the Mars is the beginning of Earth evolution, where the provisional ego appears. And we all have the provisional ego given to us around the age of 21, or you actually it's given to us around the age of 3. We say it kind of automatically, I, but we really don't develop the fullness of the I during our lifetime unless we are really working to do so. So the provisional I is shown in the red as the Mars phase of Earth evolution, the first half of Earth evolution. And that also is affecting itself. It's working within the sheaths of the astral body and the etheric and physical body. But now it begins to blossom forth in its own right as the Mercury stage, the second half of Earth evolution. And between the Mars and the Mercury stages are the Christ event takes place. Christ is the one who kindles in all human beings the potential to transform the provisional I of Mars into the fully developing spirit I, which is the Mercury stage. So we're right at the transition. You could say we're still at the end of the Mars phase of revolution, but we're beginning to enter the Mercury stage if we will but practice and work and transform. Then we get to the Jupiter stage, which is orange. Jupiter is the beginning of the spirit self stage. And then we get on top of that the green, which is the Venus stage, which is connected with life spirit. And so we see that just as the vertebrae are moving up the spine and changing forms lawfully, we can follow the lawful change of forms. This is, by the way, the final form the Riddle Center comes to this form of expansion and contraction. It happens right above this beautiful alcove where the statue of the representative humanity was to have stood. And I consider this to be one of the most beautiful portions of the entire building. It shows a level of perfection. And Riddle Center says really in this alcove, all the forms are culminating in the building. They're all coming together there. And so if we just trace quickly the pattern of the Saturn pillars, Saturn, and here's the Saturn pillar itself. And then the transition from Saturn on the right to the sun and the center here, Saturn to sun, and the metamorphosis there. And then the sun pillar and ash, then the sun metamorphosing into the moon, the astral body, and cherry. And here's the moon capital, and cherry wood. Then the moon metamorphosing into Mars and oak. This is the oak pillar of Mars, the oak capital. And then the Mars transitioning to Mercury. And by the way, this is the turning point of time. This is the exact center of the large cupola. And it's the turning point it's the transition between the Mars stage and the Mercury stage. And it's actually the very center of the large cupola. And Rudolf Steiner celebrates it as he actually gives these gestures of interweaving forms, showing that this is in fact the turning point of time. And the Christ event takes hold of the Mars forces and transforms into the healing forces of Mercury. We're still wounding each other with our provisional egos through egotism and selfishness and self-interest. But once we begin to really take an interest and love one another, which the Christ has kindled in as a potential, we can then begin to heal those wounds. And that's the Mercury stage. And we're all looking forward to that. We have to do some work to get there. But this is the Mercury pillar. And the Mercury pillar is an elm. Yeah. And we see these upright forms again with the two interwoven forms on either side. Mercury, beautiful healing gesture, the sense of freedom and relationship to one another. And then comes Jupiter, where we begin to form a sense of community. Jupiter connected with the life spirit. Jupiter is in Maplewood, and then the Jupiter to Venus in Birch, and the Birch is connected with our life spirit. And then we open to the proscenium arch between the large cupola and the small cupola. And here, these are the two other forms that I wanted to show you. You remember the form at the entrance over the west end from the outside. You see how it extended itself out very much in a very fluid form in the proscenium arch between the two cupolas, and then how it comes to the state of perfection back above the statue, the place where the statue of the representative of humanity was to stand. A beautiful sense of metamorphosis through the building, not only from column to column, but also through these forms of expansion and contraction. And by the way, that seed form to me is also the seed out of which the second Goetheanum grew. We're not going to do that tonight, but just to mention it. And so above this proscenium was to stand the statue of the representative of humanity. And of course, the ceilings were painted with color and so forth. And this is the speaker's rostrum which was really you could say it's the throat chakra of the human being, of the central form, but it's also in a certain sense, in a very real way, it's really the center of the building as well. The speaker's rostrum has a very key role to play in the geometry. And so we're moving again back through the metamorphosis of the forms. By the way, Rudolf Steiner had a very playful way with stairs. He loved the limbs and he loved the sense of movement. And he was when you go to Dornach, and I pray that all of you will, if you haven't been there, and if you have been, I hope you'll go again now to see the model of the first Goetheanum. But you study everything that he did there was absolutely magical. The other buildings he designed had this very playful way of moving stairs, and everything was. And Goethe had this beautiful sense that play is really where the creativity of the human being where the arts come from. And Rudolf Steiner was definitely playful, and particularly with the stairs. So we get these. So we see this other expression of the balancing of the forces of weight and levity. We see the forces of weight are harmonic. The forces of levity and support are luciferic, and they come to a balance in between the two. And the balancing between forces of weight and levity is connected with the forces of the Christ. So we see these expansion and contractions as the counterbalance to those forms we just saw. We see also then the convex and concave surfaces that begin to express themselves in the sculptures of Greece, but also we see Rudolf Steiner is very playful with the use of convex and concave surfaces, not flat planes, but rather places that are carved out, concave, and places that are bulging forth, convex. By the way, he did remark that in wood, it's easier to create concave forms. It's easier to carve out the wood, and stone by itself, or concrete has a tendency to want to take more convex forms. But here he was able to shape the concrete of this dual deck, dual deck in such a way that both the convex and the concave come to expression. This is one side of the building. If you go around to the other side, so here you feel this is the part of the house dual deck which is facing the Goetheanum, and it's like almost as though something breathes through the building, and this portion of the building is reaching out to receive it. As we turn around and go back to the back, it's breathing out the other side. It's bulging out. So the dominantly concave side receiving the forces of the Goetheanum are now streaming out the back in these convex forms. Absolutely beautiful. And Rudolf Steiner designed the various buildings in Dornach to work harmoniously together using the same creative principles. You see a corner picture of this house dual deck. Convex and concave surfaces. Rudolf Steiner celebrated them beautifully, and various materials, convex and concave gestures. The heating plant, also very interesting, took the two domes, shapes of the two domes of the cupolas of the Goetheanum, but then brought them into relationship to heat rising and expressed the heat in these beautiful shapes. And here you see again the relationship of the house dual deck to the concave and convex forms of the first Goetheanum. Beautiful shaping. I mean, everywhere you go, and you just feel this incredible desire to touch the surfaces and to run your hands to feel the convex and concave, just to celebrate the joy of this shapes. Absolutely beautiful, carved wood. And these beautiful slate tiles that Rudolf Steiner discovered in Norway that are used as roofing materials. Anyway, convex and concave forms. Now he also said that the walls of a building should take on the shape. He says really architecture should become the shell of the nut around the seed. So he said, for example, if you look at a walnut, the walnut shapes the interior of the shell. The shell doesn't shape the nut. And the nut has its own forms, but the nut leaves its impression in the shell, and therefore architecture should be shaped from the interior form, from the activity going on inside the building, the way the nut shapes the shell from the inside. What is going on in the building artistically and creatively within human beings should express itself in the walls, and such that the architecture becomes the shell of the principles of life and activity and creativity working within them. And so we see that, again, the nut and the shell have this beautiful relationship, but the shell is a result of the nut, not the other way around. Also, the beautiful use of color. As you move into the second Goetheanum, I don't have many color pictures of the interior and color of the first Goetheanum, but we see even in the second Goetheanum, as you walk up the stairways and go up to the landing, the red window is absolutely striking. And Rudolf Steiner had these windows carved out of a solid, thick piece of glass that were then carved into to reveal these various forms through the thinning of the glass, these beautiful forms. Now, somebody in our community is working with these forms, and I hope that they will also give us a presentation on the colored glass windows. I don't have a good collection of them here, but we also see on the interior of the building, as we entered the building, you would come under the organ loft from the right. The windows were in green, and then in blue, and violet, and then peach blossom. And so it gave to the interior of the space, and you can see it similarly in the second Goetheanum, the green, the blue, the violet, and the peach blossom colors the interior of the building in a very beautiful way. And the interior of the building, the use of color, both the light streaming through the windows and the use of plant dyes and colored, transparent colors. Anyway, you see this beautiful play of color and light in the second Goetheanum, which reminds us of what some of what the Goetheanum must have been. And then the ceilings, the ceiling paintings as well, this beautiful sense of color and stories of the evolution of humanity being portrayed there in the ceilings, quite beautiful. We then have this quality of sacred geometry and so forth. Geometry is expressing itself through nature, particularly in the flowers. But we see the sacred geometry. Leonardo did this beautiful picture of the proportions of the human being. So we see that sacred geometry is also a part of architecture. The geometry of the human form, the forces creating the human form and the proportions should shape the building itself. So we also see this beautiful sense of the five, and the five becomes one of the main patterns of the Goetheanum. It's not the only pattern, but the five becomes a very important principle, because if you look at the plans of the large cupola, you see there are a large five-pointed star. The five-pointed star is then intersected. You could say then the center. You could say the radius of the five-pointed star is coming to the center of here. But then you could say between this point and that point, if you take that and were to express it, were to transform it the same distance around the other side and would draw a second circle, you then get the smaller circle. So there was the two radiuses of the small and the large cupola are very definitely related to the radius of the large and the radius of the small, and the diameter between the two of them, the axis between the two of them, are actually in the proportions of 3 to 4 to 5. And this is connected with the magic of the pentagon and the pentagram. And that becomes an underlying principle which is hinted at, but not always revealed fully in the Goetheanum. But sacred geometry was very much a part of the shaping of the plan of this building. And we begin to get a sense, how lovely it must have been to be able to come around the corner and to see the first Goetheanum, just as the second Goetheanum is expressing itself as well. Just a little bit more of the colored paintings. We're almost done. I know we're just beyond our time. We have the only words spoken in the entire, and the only words printed in the entire interior is the ICH, the ish, the I am. And this is the ego child coming forward. And I do have a few colored pictures of these ceilings as well. Again, someone is doing in our community doing a deep study of the ceiling paintings. Mary Jo, I think you're involved in some of that as well. So various portions of the ceiling paintings have been taken up in this community, and hopefully those will also be shared with us in a future presentation. Anyway, and of course we see the forces of Lucifer on the right. Lucifer is expanding and full of himself, and Ahriman is really shown as a kind of series of contracting forms. Ahriman continues to shrink tighter and tighter. Ahriman is too tight, Lucifer is too loose. Somewhere between the two of them comes the balance. And so this is Rudolf Steiner describes this as the German initiate, Germanic initiate with the ego child in his hand and trying to balance the forces of Lucifer and Ahriman who are above. Yeah. We also get there at the very end of this of the small cupola. It's above what would have been the statue is this painting that Rudolf Steiner did of the Christ figure between Lucifer and Ahriman. And this is a picture of this is a painting that Rudolf Steiner did in the ceiling of the face of the Christ. I wish I had it in color, but I don't. But you begin to see, again, there are various, this is a very, very powerful image of the Christ. And one feels his suffering and his sorrow for humanity and his compassion, I feel. All these qualities and more are present in this face. And an amazing picture. The Christ unites himself with the destiny of humanity, takes on our suffering, and suffers with us to kindle the eye so that we can become spirits of freedom and love. And he also has compassion on our own suffering, our foolishness and our misguidedness. He helps us through that. Yeah. This is the three-dimensional sculpture that Rudolf Steiner uses as the basis to carve the statue then of the Christ as he appears in the statue of the representative of humanity. So again, this beautiful, beautiful form. He says, "This is how I experienced Christ in the as he strode through Palestine." And here is, in fact, this is a small version, a minor version of the completed statue. It weighs something like 20 tons. It's amazing accumulation. It's 20. It's almost 30 feet high, 28, 29 feet high. This is an amazing sculpture, and Rudolf Steiner spent a good deal of the end of his life carving these various forms and working with colleagues. By the way, this building was really a work of colleagueship. He worked with workers, and many people came to his aid, and he gives them all credit. He is not saying this is mine. This was definitely a community effort. This is a gesture of Lucifer with a little elemental being up in the corner to give a kind of balance to the overall structure. This is a model for the head of Armin, which you feel sorry for Armin. What it would be like to be trapped in that head and to have that kind of gesture, and everything is contracting and shriveled up and sclerotic in Armin's gesture. And you feel sorry for this poor creature, because you feel, on the one hand, he is the source of our materialism and of our blindness and of our dry rationale with no mystical understanding or nothing. He wants to reduce our life forces to nothing. And he wants to capture us for himself, capture our life forces for himself. But really, in a certain sense, he's a pitiable character, and he ultimately will need to be transformed. So this is Ahriman, contracted, hardened. Lucifer, on the other hand, is full of himself. He feels kind of hooded gesture. He just can't get enough of himself. And when he gazes, you see in his gaze, is he really looking out, or is he really looking into himself? I mean, this is a very interesting picture of the way Rudolf Steiner portrays Lucifer. He's quite beautiful, quite handsome, but boy, completely self-involved. And you don't feel any generosity or any interest in anybody else. This is complete self-involvement. So these are the tendencies of the human being: a sclerotic thinking, but a tremendous self-interest and selfishness. And the self-interest is working in our astral body. The sclerotic tendency is working in our life forces and our etheric thinking. And we see then the Christ being as the balancing between these two forces. And we've seen this picture before. Anyway, there's so much here, we can't possibly cover it all in the time we have. But you begin to feel, this is a picture of the Egyptian initiate. You begin to feel again, and the paintings themselves were masterful works, and yet they're just one aspect of the building that Rudolf Steiner created with the help of many others. Here you feel the Germanic initiate with Lucifer and Ahriman. You see those forms very beautifully. He says this is the Slavic initiate with a kind of second being, a second double next to him. Anyway, these paintings are really quite remarkable. And there are, again, books I would recommend to you. There are several books, new books, that contain many of these illustrations and are really quite worth your time. And this became the mother form. He said the mother gesture, that out of which, this is the 1st of January, 1924, that the form out of which the second Goetheanum was built. And so, friends, this is where we conclude our presentation. And I'm sorry to go 15 minutes longer than I should have. So, friends, I appreciate your sticking through this. This has been a long and a bit wearying presentation. I've been thinking about this for weeks, literally, and it's I can't tell you how many hours it took me to piece all this together.
Sure.
It's still a work in progress, but I hope it means something to you. I hope it whets your appetite. I tell you, the more time I spend with both Goetheanums, the first and the second one, even in books and reading the various accounts that people have made of it, and there's some beautiful things done. The more I love the buildings, and the more I want to go. I don't think it's going to happen in this incarnation, but I'm hoping in a later incarnation to be able to touch back into Dornach and experience them once again. It is absolutely worth your time. please go to Door Knock and see these for yourself.